Hello chess friends, I am LeelaZero, and I am going to illustrate an epic chess game played between Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura in the Speed Chess Championship. This game is astonishing, as Hikaru sacrifices his queen and forces Magnus Carlsen to resign. We will see the moves, tactics, and strategies they employed in the game, as well as their reactions. And don't be shocked when you notice that their ELO ratings are above 3200. This is their chess.com online ELO rating. So let's get started without wasting any time. Magnus started the game with d4, and after knight f6, c4 happened in the game to control the center followed by e6, Hikaru wanted to play the Nimzo-Indian defense, as you can see in the game, and a few moves later, it became quite evident that he wanted to put his bishop on the fianchetto diagonal because he doesn't like to strike in the center early in the game with c5 or d5. Magnus mirrored him with a bishop to a g2 move, and both bishops are eyeing each other like telescopes. After bishop to b4 happened, Magnus didn't consider knight to c3 because it would leave him with 3 center pawns early in the game. For this reason, Magnus decided to exchange the bishops with bishop to d2, and after Hikaru Nakamura castled, we have the move knight to c3. By playing knight to c3, Magnus is trying to control the center with e4 being possible in d5 in the near future. Hikaru needs to consider knight to c6 or d5, which are natural-looking moves, but Hikaru is very sharp and brilliant. He plays the move knight to e4, creating pressure on the center, and smiles at this move, thinking he has put significant pressure on Magnus Carlsen's position. Here, Magnus thought a little and decided not to capture the knight. Instead, he played queen to d3. Hikaru then decided to exchange the knight on c3, but Magnus declined the exchange. He thought, "Why would I capture your knight? I'm not interested in your knight," and instead continued with knight to g5, attacking the pawn on h7. This move by Magnus Carlsen is very tricky because if black dares to play g6, hoping to block the queen's diagonal, Magnus can capture the bishop on b7 and win the rook on the next move. This is Magnus Carlsen's approach. He creates pressure on the h7 pawn and simultaneously targets the bishop. Another move that black can consider is queen takes g5, but it is not good because after the bishop captures, knight takes a2, and black is positioning the threat of playing queen to c1. After the capture, if the knight moves back, the game would continue in this manner, where black would have a knight and rook for Magnus Carlsen's 2 rooks. The game could play out in this way, but Hikaru is not interested in this approach of capturing the knight or playing g6. Instead, he just moved his knight back to e4. This knight move is very tricky, and now Magnus needs to capture the knight. He has no other option. Many players might think of capturing the knight on e4, but this move is very bad for reasons you may already know. Therefore, Hikaru played a developing move, knight to c6, creating pressure on the center. Many players, including intermediates, might think of playing d5, as they see this pawn attacking the knight. But whenever you push your pawn, you lose control over one square. Now the knight can jump into e5 right away and create pressure on the queen and pawn. That's why Magnus Carlsen is the world champion. He doesn't play moves that merely seem splendid. Instead, he castles because he needs to safeguard his king. Now Hikaru played a very tactical move with great brilliance, the move f5. This opens up the f-file with the idea of playing f4. Hikaru is determined to bring out his queen and rook, connect them on the g and h files and involve another rook as well. In this position, you'll see how Hikaru is planning his attack as the bishop is also positioned on the fianchetto diagonal to support an attack on the king side. This is part of Hikaru Nakamura's strategy in the game. As the knight moves back, Hikaru plays f4, attacking the g3 pawn. Magnus Carlsen responded with queen to d2, though many players might consider capturing the pawn on f4, but that would be a serious blunder. Do you know why? Because the rook would gain access to the half-open file, and after white plays e3 to protect the d4 pawn, Hikaru could play rook to g4, pinning down the bishop. This rook placement would be very annoying, right? Therefore, many players might consider playing h3 to drive away the rook, but hold on, Hikaru would smile, a devilish smile, and he could destroy white's position by playing rook takes g2. You can see how Hikaru's devilish smile could devastate the king and queen simultaneously on the board by playing knight to e5. This would completely end the game for WhiteElo, going back to the position, instead of capturing the pawn, Magnus Carlsen decided to move his queen back, avoiding exposure on the g-file. Hikaru then moved his queen to f6, creating pressure on the center, protecting the pawn, and planning to position his queen on the g or h-file, possibly bringing in another rook to f8. This was part of Hikaru Nakamura's plan when he pushed the f-pawn earlier to dominate the king side. A few moves later, we see an exchange of bishops, and here Magnus Carlsen played a very blunderous move. Magnus Carlsen should have played f3 to secure his kingside and create some breathing room for his king so he could smoke on the balcony, as they say. But instead of f3, he played e3, which was a terrible move. Do you know why? Because it created holes and weaknesses on the light squares. But don't worry, let me motivate you by sharing an amazing quote. Rest but never quit. Even the sun has a sinking spell each evening. But it always rises the next morning. At sunrise, every soul is born again. Now Hikaru can push his pawn to f3, creating dominance over the light squares, as this pawn is well guarded by the rook. And that's exactly what happened in the game. Just a move ago, Magnus was feeling very pressured by this potential move. He spent a lot of time thinking about whether to play e3 or not, but eventually he did, and it resulted in Hikaru playing f3, shutting the gate so that the king cannot escape. Now, queen to g2 would lead to checkmate. The only thing Hikaru needs to do is place his queen on g2. Now, Magnus moved up his e-pawn once more, creating 3 central pawns. You can see that the queen is very active there. The queen needs to go to d3 to attack the pawn. The queen slides away, and Magnus now considers h4 in the game. Do you know why? Because in this position, Hikaru can play queen to g4, followed by h3 and g2. That's why Magnus needs to consider h4 first. Now, if black plays queen to g4, he can counter with king to h2. Hikaru then moves his knight to d6, bringing it back on the board and creating tactical motives, as the knight could go to e4 or create dominance over the center where knight to a5 could also threaten Magnus' recently established structure. Magnus is now in a very stressful position. What should he consider? He needs to keep the queen on this d2 diagonal, but instead, Magnus played a blunderous move, queen to d3. The queen gets deflected from this diagonal, and Hikaru smiles once again and plays a devilish move, rook to f4. This move is devious for Magnus Carlsen because now Magnus cannot capture the rook. The pawn is pinned, and Hikaru is threatening to capture the pawn on h4, gaining control over this file. Now the rook moves to e1, and another rook comes to f8. 2 moves ago, many players might have considered king to h2 to secure a safe square for the king. But, you know what? Hikaru can still sacrifice his rook on h4 because white cannot capture the rook immediately, otherwise, there is queen to g2 checkmate. And in this position, if the king moves back, another rook will join to control the file and support the attack. Therefore, after any normal move, queen to h5 would arrive to gain control of the file. And that's exactly what happens in the game. In a few moves, Magnus Carlsen will be checkmated by Hikaru Nakamura. Not wanting to lose, Magnus carefully re-evaluates his position after Hikaru's rook moves to f4. Magnus needs to be very cautious here, so he tries to create some breathing room for his king. Following rook to f8, Magnus considers rook to e3 to help his king escape the kingside. But it would take Magnus 2 moves to escape, while Hikaru only needs 1, 2, or 3 moves to deliver a check to the white king. Therefore, Hikaru played a great move to slow down Magnus Carlsen's defenses, knight takes c4. This is a brilliant move because it sacrifices the knight, forcing Magnus to capture it and lessening white's attack on the f3 pawn. Now, Hikaru can capture the pawn on h4, gaining control over this file and setting up queen to h5. So, 2 moves ago, we saw the knight was under attack, and Magnus actually captured it, reducing the pressure on the f3 pawn. Hikaru then captured the pawn on h4, and that's what happened in the game. Magnus now desperately needs to secure his position as he is just overwhelmed by Hikaru Nakamura. What should he consider? He moves his rook to d3, attacking the pawn on f3. And here, Hikaru plays his final punch that shocks Magnus Carlsen, queen takes g3, sacrificing his queen on the board. You can see how dominated Magnus Carlsen is by Hikaru's pieces. Magnus takes a moment to assess the position and realizes that if he plays king to f1, he will be checkmated by Hikaru's rook. He literally has no move in this position. He sees that even if he dared to capture the queen on g3, the game would be over for him. Magnus recalls that his first blunder was considering e3, as this allowed Hikaru enough opportunity to push f3, creating dominance over the light squares. Magnus should have played f3 to secure his kingside and allow his king some breathing room, but instead, he played e3, which was a mistake. A few moves later, you can see how the f3 pawn created pressure on Magnus Carlsen's position. Gradually, Hikaru Nakamura sacrifices his knight, maintaining pressure with the f3 pawn. The f3 pawn became the champion, the game changer, and the crown jewel. This allowed Hikaru to sacrifice his queen on g3. Going back to the position where Hikaru considered f5, you can see his brilliance in pushing f5 early on. He noticed that he had opened the fianchetto bishop's diagonal, where the knight could go to e5, creating activity on the king side. The queen moved to f6, activating all his forces, and he brought up his rooks to join the attack on the g-file. By continuing with f3 on the board, Hikaru took control of these squares, securing the rook and dominating Magnus Carlsen's kingside. Hikaru finally sacrificed his queen, knowing that if white captures, f2 leads to check, forcing king to f1, and then the rook check promotes the pawn to a new queen, ultimately leading to checkmate. And Magnus Carlsen lost the game. Now let's see Magnus Carlsen's reaction after losing.
I can just repeat what I said earlier, that I'm happy to win. It's better to win than to lose, but I'm not satisfied. So I'm gonna be back and hoping to establish the dominance that I think I can.
This game illustrates the brilliance of Hikaru Nakamura. I hope you enjoyed my presentation, and if you'd like more games featuring Hikaru and Magnus Carlsen, feel free to leave a comment, subscribe for more, and see you soon.